Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being. Okay, it's been a while since I've done one of these videos, but we're back and looking to move on with Derrida, and today we're talking about signification. So I've broken the video up into three parts. The first part we'll look at what Derrida has to say about Saussure and his ideas and some of the ideas that Derrida picks up from Saussure. Then we'll talk about Derrida, what Derrida does with this notion of signification, how he extends Saussure and kind of builds his own picture of signification and signs. And then we'll finish up with a little section on difference. So the first part then is Saussure. So we're starting with this topic. The question is just simply, what is a sign? And Saussure says every sign is characterized by a difference between the signifier and the signified. So every sign has this twofold character. He says one sensible, which is the signifier, and the other intelligible, which is the signified. And Saussure identified two principles of general semiology and linguistics. The first one is the arbitrary character of signs, and the second is the differential character of signs. So the first one, the arbitrary, this doesn't mean that, despite how it sounds, it doesn't mean that the choice of the signifier is left entirely to the speaker. Rather, it means that, as Derrida puts it, the signifier has no natural attachment to the signified. But what does this mean? Essentially, it means that the arbitrariness or the unmotivatedness is another word that Derrida uses there. The unmotivatedness or the arbitrariness of the sign refers to a synthesis in which the completely other announces itself as such without any simplicity, any identity, any resemblance or continuity within what it is not. And you'll notice that that is exactly how we've defined the trace, that otherness that's present in all systems of signification, and that indeed is necessary for a system of signification to be such a system. So arbitrary captures that notion of otherness, the trace that's present in signs. And the second principle of Saussure's there is the differential character of signs. And so this is another key idea for Derrida. And I'll give you a quote. Derrida quotes Saussure from his course in general linguistics. It goes like this. In language, there are only differences. A difference generally implies positive terms between which the difference is set up. But in language, there are only differences without positive terms. Whether we take the signified or the signifier, language has neither ideas nor sounds that existed before the linguistic system, but only conceptual and phonic differences that have issued from the system. The idea of phonic substance that a sign contains is of less importance than the other signs that surround it. And so this is exactly what Derrida says about difference, right? Difference with an A. And it's essentially the linchpin of his philosophy. And here it is prefigured in Saussure. So there are only differences in language, Saussure says. There's no positivity. Every concept is necessarily and essentially inscribed in a chain or a system, and it refers within that system to other concepts. So words refer to concepts which refer to other concepts, all within these bounded, finite systems. We've talked about that before. That's essentially difference. But it's just interesting to see that it comes directly here from Saussure. And it just occurred to me while I was preparing this video that this is almost exactly Wittgenstein's idea with his notion of language games. And specifically there in philosophical investigations, he talks about a game. What is a game? How do you define a game? And he says it doesn't actually have a concrete referent. No matter how precisely you try and define what a game is, it's always going to be ambiguous. It's never going to directly map onto something. And that's essentially what Saussure's saying here, and what Derrida says as well. And just carrying the Wittgensteinian idea a little bit further, in my notes on philosophical investigations, I wrote two principles that Wittgenstein notes and that apply directly here, I think. The first is that words don't name objects. So linguistic objects, Wittgenstein says, are neither somethings nor nothings. And that's essentially what Saussure is aiming at here. And the second principle is that words signify only within a practical context that must already be known. And again, that is something that Saussure is saying here. There's a system, there's a context within which words make sense in relation to other words in that same context. Just interesting to note that that overlap there with Wittgenstein. Of course, we don't want to carry that too far, because Wittgenstein talks about that notion of family resemblance, which is connected with similarities between different concepts, and that's really drifting away from what Derrida is going, where Derrida is going with this idea. But still, it's just interesting to see that connection. And the last part of that quote just made me think of something else as well. Words get their meanings from the surrounding words. So the difference between the word and other words around them. And that's what's primary in their meaning, in their signification, is this whole context and the differences that exist between them and other parts of that context. And I think a real life example of this that that just came to mind while I was writing this is in I speak Korean, not fluently, but proficiently, and so I can have a conversation in Korean. And I thought one day someone asked me to translate a Korean, an article into English. And I was really surprised at how difficult it was. And there were even sentences. There were times when I could understand and I knew what every single word in the sentence meant, but I still didn't understand what they were trying to say. And I think that captures or connects to this idea that words don't have specific reference, ENTS, that you can just pluck out and stick in and derive meaning from. There's something to that contextuality of a sentence that is over and above the words that make it up. And I just thought, I remember it was really frustrating. I could understand every word. I knew what every word meant, but I still didn't grasp the meaning of the sentence. I couldn't translate it. I think that's a good example of this idea that words, rather than being references to other concepts, they get their meaning from their relation to other parts of the sentence or the article or the the context, the era in which these words are being used. So the meaning arises from the difference. Okay, so anyway, that's basically what Derrida has to say about Saussure here. In the second part of the video, I want to move on to talk about what Derrida himself, how he extends these ideas and where he takes them. Okay, so signs are composed of a signifier and a signified. What does this tell us about the sign as Derrida understands it? So first up, it tells us that the signified and the signifier are different, or they belong to different orders. The order of the signified is never contemporary. It is at best the inverse or the subtly discrepant parallel, discrepant by the time of a breath, of the order of the signifier. So basically this is capturing, taking up that idea of Saussure's, that the signifier is sensible and the signified is intelligible, but he's extending it a little bit, or perhaps translating it such that the talking about these different orders is leading us into this idea of the signified being transcendental and the signifier being immanent. And then never, and there is this clear gap between the two. They're never contemporary. Derrida says they're the inverse or the subtly discrepant parallel. So there is this marked distinction between the two. And that's how I'm going to analyze them in what follows in this section. So we'll take the signified first, and there are a couple of things that I want to say about this. The first is the signified as transcendental. So the notion of a transcendental signified would place a reassuring end to the redirection from sign to sign. We have identified logocentrism and the metaphysics of presence as the exigent, powerful, systematic, and irrepressible desire for such a signified. So the transcendental signified, transcendental just because it is intelligible, it belongs to a different order from the sensible, which is the signifier, the word, the spoken word, the written word, whatever it is, a gesture, but there's something sensible to the signifier, and it refers to something intelligible, something intangible, transcendental, something beyond the realm of the sensible. And that's what that's all the transcendental indicates here. So the transcendental signified functions as a concept that is beyond, i.e. transcendental, the sensible signifier. Okay, good, different orders. And therefore, the transcendental signified halts the way that signs continually refer to other signs. As Derrida says, the redirection from sign to sign. So instead of, and that's one of his key ideas about signification, is that they are this never-ending reference. Each sign, each word, each concept refers to another, and there's no ultimate final ground. There's no ultimate final capital T, if you like, truth. Each word has meaning only within this context, be it, and when I say context there, it could be like a field, a discipline, but I think in Derrida's mind, he's referring to something more like an era, an epoch, a reference to the the time in which that word is being used, the values of the society, the customs, the traditions, all of those things that are contemporary, that they form this context for language, for signs to have meaning. So the signs refer to other signs, and this idea of a transcendental signified gives a destination to our thinking. It stops this endless reference, this referential movement. It brings it to a halt and gives us a kind of a certain stable ground where our thought can finally rest in something that we can claim to be the truth, a universal, generalizable, capital T truth. And this, we've talked about, is as Derrida says, the desire of logocentrism and the metaphysics of presence, because it is, in his words, reassuring. And it's reassuring because it gives us a fixed, meaningful, ordered system of thought. A system of thought that is, instead of contingent and merely reflective of the era in which we live, or the beliefs that we hold, or the values that we have, it's grounded in this capital T truth, something that gives us a solid, stable ground from which to act and to think and to philosophize. So this desire of logocentrism and the metaphysics of presence to get to this capital T truth, this transcendental signified that fixes our systems, gives us some order and coherence. And this really reminds me a little bit of Camus, who said something similar when he talked about the human desire for order. We desire order in the world, in reality, but it isn't actually there. And it's this is the clash that for Camus produces the absurd. We don't have to go that far, but it just came to mind while I was preparing this, so I thought I'd mention it. The desire of logocentrism to give us a meaningful, ordered system of signification, and it's kind of paralleled in what Camus says about our desire for order. Okay, so and this obviously, this notion of transcendental signified is the antithesis of Derrida's philosophy, which is centered in difference with an A, creativity, play. It's always open. It's never closed. It never congeals around a fixed point from which we can begin our thinking, or from which we can act. Thought does, we can crystallize around certain ideas, but those ideas are always contingent. They're always open to change. There's never an absolute end, and there's never an absolute ground from which we can proceed. The second thing about the signified I want to talk about is the signified as presence. And I'll give you a quote to start this off. The formal essence of the signified is presence, and the privilege of its proximity to the logos as phone is the privilege of presence. So the formal essence of the signified is presence. Why? Because even though it's not, say, literally present, hence the need for a signifier to indicate it, to refer to it, the signifier represents the signified as something present, i.e. as the original always present notion, concept, idea. So in a way, and we'll come back to this idea later when we talk about the signifier isn't real. It's not, it's just a stand-in for the signified, which is therefore the only genuine, real, present thing here. And one way to think about this is to think that we pass right through the signifier, which we can imagine as insubstantial, and go right to the signified, which is the only substantial thing, i.e. the only real or present thing in this whole context. So that the signified is presence, and that's quite important to understand, I think. And the signified then as the present thing which the signifier represents is seen as privileged, precisely because, as we talked about in the last video, presence is linked with logos, that law-like fixedness of reason and speech, the immediate proximity with the soul, we called it. And this is how we think, how we understand signification, what signification is for us. However, Derrida adds this other, or makes this other point about the signified. The signified, he says, is actually never present in itself. And what he means by that, I'll give you a quote and then we'll look at that. The signified concept is never present in itself, in an adequate presence that would refer only to itself. Every concept is necessarily and essentially inscribed in a chain or a system within which it refers to another, and to other concepts by the systematic play of differences. So no signified concept is present in itself, and rather than meaning present or presence here, we've just said the signified is presence within signification. But Derrida is saying that it's not present in the sense that it is an adequate presence that would refer only to itself, i.e. self-contained, complete in and of itself, independent. In other words, every signified is related to other signifieds by that systematic play of differences in a chain or a system. And no signified can halt this process of signification. No signified can lock us into a fixed, eternal, universal truth, for example. And this kind of does clash with what we just said about the way that the transcendental signified does halt that never-ending referential cycle, and the way that it is presence. But basically Derrida's pointing out here, I think, the inconsistencies in the way that we think about signification. So signification for us is, the way we understand it, the way it's used, is as if the signified is a transcendental signified where that referential chain stops and it is present. It's understood as present. It gives us that reassuring substantial grounding that we desire. However, and this is Derrida's point, that's an illusion. Every signified refers to other signifieds, and this chain, this continual play of difference is ongoing. And when we think it isn't, we are just deceiving ourselves and buying into a kind of false sense of security there. So anyway, that's the signified. Moving on to talk about the signifier, there are a couple of points that I want to make here. The first, and this is the main one, the signifier is a deferred presence. We ordinarily say that a sign is put in place of the thing itself, the present thing. Signs represent the present in its absence. They take the place of the present. When we cannot take hold of or show the thing, let us say the present, the being present, when the present does not present itself, then we signify. We go through the detour of signs. The sign would thus be a deferred presence. Following this classical semiology, the substitution of the sign for the thing itself is both secondary and provisional. It is second in order after an original and lost presence, a presence from which the sign would be derived. It is provisional with respect to this final and missing presence, in view of which the sign would serve as a movement of mediation. Okay, so remember we talked about the way that the signified is presence in the last section. The signifier, although Derrida says sign in the quote, a little bit confusingly I think it's clear he's referring to the signifier. The signifier then is a deferred presence because remember that being nothing in itself, the signifier is nothing actual, nothing substantial, nothing. It's not actual presence itself. It's just an indicator that directs us to the only thing that's real. Another way to think about this is like an actual sign. If you're traveling somewhere, the sign itself is not a place. It's not a destination. It's not an actual place. The only actual place is at the destination. The sign is just something you pass by to get there. So it's not, in the context of this analogy, it's not anything substantial, i.e. it's not an actual place. The same thing here, the signifier, it's not an actual presence. It's not an actual thing. It just points us in the direction. So it's not as not an actual presence, Derrida calls it a deferred presence, because it is that present signified, but it is that present signified as deferred, as and this is what he also says, it is that present signified as absent. It's that present that is absence, and that's what the signifier is, this deferred presence. Hopefully that makes sense. And another word that Derrida uses there is detour, to get to highlight the same idea. It's getting to the destination. It's pointing out the route to get to the destination. It itself is not a destination. It itself is not anything substantial or real. It's not a real presence. But it is still something there. And so Derrida calls it a deferred presence. It's like, and I'm kind of repeating myself here, but it's like we can imagine the present thing as absent. That's what the signifier is. It's the absence of the present signified. And being that, Derrida calls it a deferred presence, which I think is quite a nice way to describe this. It really makes sense to me. And so at the end of the quote, he talks about the signifier as a substitution for the present thing. The signifier, therefore, is secondary, so appearing after the original and lost presence, which is the transcendental signified, and it's provisional. So it's a stand-in for this original present thing. However, as we saw with the signified, the signifier also is never present in itself. And the quote that I'll give you is actually related to writing, but it makes the point quite nicely, I think. Even within so-called phonetic writing, the graphic signifier refers to the phoneme through a web of many dimensions which links it, like all signifiers, to other written and oral signifiers within a total system, open, let us say, to all possible investments of sense. We must begin with the possibility of that total system. So this is essentially exactly what we just saw with the signified. Any signifier is related to other signifiers within a total system, which is open to all possible investments of sense. It's open to other possible meanings and interpretations, and this brings in Derrida's notions of force, play, difference, all of those, creativity, all of those things come in here again, as they did with the signified. And so he says we must begin with this total system, because when we focus on isolated, localized meanings and significations, we lose sight of the wider picture out of which these meanings are being drawn at the exclusion of other meanings. So we get locked into thinking that this system is the system, this framework, this context within which our words have the meanings that they have and signify the things that they do. This is the only one. We've got the final, the correct version, the universal, eternal, capital T truth. And then we close ourselves off to other equally possible, equally valid truths, small t truths. And again, this is the same as it was with the signified. This is what signifiers really are. However, we imagine them when we think about signification, language, signs. We think of the signifier as referring to this presence, and that's the key idea. The signified is presence, the signifier is a deferred presence. But they both trend, they both hone in, they both refer to a presence. And that's kind of where I want to head next, the idea of signification itself as presence. So given everything we've said about the signified as a transcendental presence, the signifier as a deferred presence, i.e. the transcendental present in its absence, it's clear that the very notion of a sign itself has always been taken to mean the representation of a presence and has been constituted in a system of thought or language determined on the basis of and in view of presence. So the whole act of signification revolves around presence. And it is thus a core part of what Derrida, or of the history of metaphysics, that Derrida is trying to overcome. And the final thing I want to mention in this second part is the idea of the sign as theological. And this kind of crops up when we think about the different orders to which the component parts of the sign belong. So the signifier and the signified, and these two together make up the unity of a heterogeneity, Derrida says, and entail a difference between the signified, which is intelligible, pure, pristine even, transcendental, and the signifier, which is an expulsion or a fall into the exteriority of the sensible. And it's exactly this transcendental nature of the signified over and above the sensible nature, immanent nature, if you like, of the signifier, which brings about the theological connotations. And so Derrida says the sign is essentially theological. Okay, and we'll move into the last part of the video, which is just a shorter part, talking about difference with an A. So with everything we've said here about signification and signs, how does this all connect back to difference with an A? Or what can we note about difference with an A in light of what we've just looked at? The first thing, well, actually there are two things, and they're both the same, but they are the same in different ways, if that makes sense. So the first thing is, or the thing that we're taking away from this section is the difference with an A doesn't belong to signification. But there are two ways that it doesn't belong to signification. The first is in light of this notion of presence. And the quote that I have here is a repetition actually of the last quote, in fact, but I just am going to include the very beginning of the quote, which I left out a moment ago. Difference can no longer be understood according to the concept of sign, which has always been taken to mean the representation of a presence and has been constituted in a system of thought or language determined on the basis of and in view of presence. So since signs are rooted in presence, they're grounded in everything about them is concerned with presence, as we just saw. Since that's true, since that's the case, difference with an A can never be understood as a sign. It's never just, it can't be properly grasped within a system of signification. It's not a sign, because signs are always about the presence. Signs are always about presence as transcendental signified. And that's the exact opposite of what difference with an A is all about. And the second reason that difference with an A doesn't belong to signification is that it's not present in itself. And the quote that I have for this one is another one that we've looked at before, but this time I cut off the end, so I'm going to include that, and then that will make this connection to difference with an A clearer. The signified concept is never present in itself in an adequate presence that would refer only to itself. Every concept is necessarily and essentially inscribed in a chain or a system within which it refers to another and to other concepts by the systematic play of differences. Such a play, then, difference, is no longer simply a concept, but the possibility of conceptuality, of the conceptual system and process in general. For the same reason, difference, which is not a concept, is not a mere word. That is, it is not what we represent to ourselves as the calm and present self-referential unity of a concept and sound. So difference with an A here can't be as Derrida says, the calm and present self-referential unity of a concept and a sound, i.e. the concept signified and the sound the signifier, and that that's the unity which is the sign. We represent signs to ourselves as present in themselves. That is to say, we understand them as self-contained and independent. That's what Derrida means when he says the calm and present self-referential unity of a concept and sound. And since difference with an A is essentially a play of differences with an E, since it is only what it is by referring outside of itself, it can't be understood as a sign. It doesn't have this self-referential, this calm and present self-referential unity. So it's again, it doesn't belong to signification. It's not a part of sign in this case because difference with an A is not present in itself, unlike the way that we understand signs to be within our systems of signification like language and things. There's one other thing we can say based on this quote though about difference, and it's kind of another way of thinking about difference with an A, and that is that difference is not a concept. So Derrida objects here to calling difference with an A concept because as the play of differences with an E, which belongs to signification, it is the very possibility of conceptuality. It is what allows conceptuality to arise, it's what allows concepts to arise in the first place. And therefore, it can't itself be a concept. It's the very ground on which concepts formed, by which we understand concepts. And so it goes beyond what a concept can possibly be, so it can't be understood as a concept. Okay, and that seems like a good place to hit a summary. So first up today we looked at Saussure, and we talked about his notion that a sign is comprised of a signifier and a signified. So there's a difference between these two. One is sensible, one is intelligible. And he gave us two principles of semiology: the arbitrariness of signs, which doesn't mean that they are completely it doesn't mean that you can choose any signifier to refer to any signified. Rather, it's that there's no natural attachment of the signifier to the signified. And we analyze this in terms of an otherness within every sign. And this is exactly Derrida's notion of the trace. The second principle was the differential character of signs. So there's only differences in language. That's what Saussure said. Words lead to concepts, which lead to other concepts, all bracketed within a finite, enclosed, self-referential system. And so what's more important, Saussure was saying, than the phonic substance of a sign are the signs around it. That's what gives, it's the differences between the signs that give any individual sign its meaning. Then we moved on to Derrida, and he talked about the signifier and signified belonging to different orders, the same as we saw in Saussure, the sensible and the intelligible, but he extended this idea so that the signifier was understood as immanent and the signified is understood as transcendental. And breaking each of those different orders down, we looked at the signified first and discussed the transcendental nature here, the idea that this is, the signified is a term beyond the sensible signifier, beyond meaning transcendent to or transcendental, beyond the sensible signifier, which ends the continual signifying, the never-ending referential character that designates signs, that signs embody, to culminate then in the capital T truth. That's what the transcendental signified was. It was this ending, a destination point for our thoughts. And the signified we talked about as being present and proximate to the logos as phone. So the formal essence of the signified is presence. The signified is the only real or substantial thing in signification, and the presence that the signified is links us to logos and speech and the whole metaphysics of presence that Derrida talks about. However, in actual fact, the signified is never present in itself. So it's never a self-contained, self-referential, fully independent entity. Rather, every signified is related to other signifieds by a play of differences in a chain or a system. And then we talked about the signifier, which Derrida describes as a deferred presence. So the signifier is nothing in itself. It is just the signified, which is present. But it is this present signified as absent. It's the absent present signified. Hence, the signifier itself is deferred, or Derrida describes it also as being a detour that leads us to the signified. And this meant that the signifier was first secondary, so it appears after an original and lost presence, i.e. the transcendental signified, and it's provisional. So the signifier is essentially a stand-in for the original present thing. And as we saw with the signified, the signifier is also never present in itself. Signifiers are always related to other signifiers, never wholly and simply what they are. And then we looked at the sign itself, and as that heterogeneous unity, and the sign, the signifier plus the signified, belongs to a system which is determined by presence. The signified, remember, is a transcendental presence. The signifier is a deferred presence. Therefore, signification itself is all about presence. It's 100% grounded in presence. And we also looked at the way that for Derrida, the sign is theological. So a reference to the transcendental nature of the signified and the sensible nature of the signifier. This division between the two is inherently or intrinsically for Derrida theological. And finally, we looked at difference with an A. And we talked about the two expressions for why it cannot be a sign. The first was from presence. Signs, as we just saw, are fully determined by and within presence. And obviously, difference with an A has nothing to do with that, so it can't be a sign. And also, we looked at this, why difference is not a sign from the notion of being present in itself. In signification, signs are understood as present in themselves, as a self-referential unity of a concept and a sound, a signified and a signifier. But that is not, again, that unity is not what difference with an A is. It's completely antithetical to difference with an A. Therefore, again, difference is not a sign. And finally, the notion that difference with an A is not a concept, because as a play of differences with an E, difference with an A is the very possibility of conceptuality. It's what grounds the process of conceptuality itself, of conceptualizing, and so it itself can't be a concept. Okay, and so that is where I'm going to finish up today. There is, I think, a fair bit of overlap between a lot of what we've covered in earlier videos, but this just really, the point of this video was really just to highlight signification and flesh out what signification means for Derrida, and so we can see, just kind of putting the pieces together. We've looked at already what difference with an A is, and now we're just seeing, filling in some of the details, I think. Anyway, hopefully that helped. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.